Greetings all, welcome to another session of Tuzi Talks. Today we're going to begin a series on second language acquisition theories, how they're developed, and some of the ways that they influence second language teaching, second language learning. We're going to primarily be using a textbook by Mitchell and Miles entitled Second Language Learning Theories, so their second edition. It's an excellent book that gives a balanced view of the number of theories and ideas that are currently existing out there in the research world. It's also going to try to show you as a language learner, language researcher, some of the ways in which theories are developed and how we can further study this emerging field. So let's just jump right into some of the key concepts that are involved in here. Today we're going to be looking at what makes a good language learning theory. And we're also going to be taking a look at the view of some of the researchers and their view on the nature of language and their view on the nature of the language learning process. Finally, we'll look at some of the views of the language teacher, and then with Miles and Mitchell's, they want to try to combine how all this fits together, all this theory fits together in the actual teaching of second language. So let's just begin by jumping into seeing what makes a good language, what makes a good theory. Let's begin by just saying, we're going to be developing theories, we're going to be studying how theories are developed, but we really ought to be saying to ourselves, well, what is second language? So let's take a first quick look at that actual idea. What is the meaning of this phrase, second language, or second language learning? Second language learning is the learning of a language of any level, provided that the learning of the second language takes place sometime after the acquisition of the first language. So therefore, someone who is living in a home, and in the home they're learning one language, and in the outside world they're learning a second language, and they're doing it simultaneously, which means it's got to be a little kid, it's got to be a tot. Other than that, it is some type of first/second language acquisition. And it could be even variants of English that we could be talking about here. But the idea here is that the first language is already learned, and now we're learning a second language, and there's going to be the difference between the two. Okay, now with the definition pushed off, let's take a look at what makes a good theory. One of the things that I like about language acquisition and language theories is that they sort of bridge the gap between the behavioralists and the more hard scientists, the cognitivists. You have people in the soft sciences who like psychiatrists, or psychologists or sociologists, and for some people, those fields of study are less, quote-unquote, less reliable because they're a soft science, as opposed to, chemistry or other types of sciences that have hard numbers and hard types of tests. Language researchers kind of bridge that gap. They're kind of like a middle road in theory. So they're going to see a bridge of this when you look at a good theory. In any event, what makes a good theory? As far as language acquisition, the theory not only has to describe what the components are and what the factors are, but it also needs to explain for all the variables. It needs to be able to explain for all the situations and procedures that could possibly be invoked to answer problems with a theory or problems with language learning. So a good theory needs to both describe and explain. As with most hard sciences, actually any type of research hypothesis developing, you need systematic inquiry. The reason why you do systematic inquiry, obviously, is so that you can cross all your T's, dot all your I's, and make sure that your procedures are in place in such a way that it can be replicable, that you try to avoid any pitfalls or holes or mistakes, and so that other people can then see more validity, more reliability in the work that you're doing. Additionally, a good theory is going to have some type of hypotheses that can be tested. And we will look at a number of hypotheses that have been posited over the years, and we'll see that some of them actually have been tested, and they've been either shown to be more reliable or less reliable because of the tests. In any event, when we make a theory, it should have a good hypothesis. It should also be a reflexive process, because we're dealing with so many variables in this whole idea of language acquisition, we need to stop and think and then rethink what we're doing, and need to be metacognitive, and we need to reevaluate things that are going on. As you will see, there were theories that happened in the past, and those theories were thought to be good until someone rethought. They had some rethinking about what was actually going on, and sparked a whole new area of study. So it's got to be a reflexive process as well. If we're going to have a language learning theory, it needs to account for a whole bunch of variables. And you'll see here there are a variety of variables here: social, attitudes, motivation, age, etc. There's a lot of variables that go into play when you're learning a language, when you're learning a second language. And so a theory of second language acquisition needs to take into account all of these particular variables in order to have a theory that is viable in all these situations. If you're going to have a theory, you should have clear and specific statements. A phrase that I often use is that you need to have something that's measurable, right? It's simple enough to be understood. It's simple enough to be tested, to be measured. So they should be clear and simple statements within your theory, within the hypotheses that you're putting forth. Again, as we said before, it should have systematic procedures. Again, so that they're replicable, so they're identifiable, so that we can increase reliability in the theory. And lastly, we need to have the theory of second language acquisition has to intersect with other theories. Things like learning theories, or motivational issues, or affective issues. And so you need to cultural impact, social factors that are going to intersect with second language acquisition. And so it needs to somehow satisfy and answer those things that are going on as well. So it's not an easy thing to set up this particular theory or to investigate a theory like this, but a good theory is going to try to answer all 6 of these particular elements. Okay, that's a kind of theory that we want to be looking at. Let's take a jump in town, look at some of the views of the nature of language. What is language? What does it consist of? There are other issues as well, as far as how language evolves within the mind. Where did it come from, for example? And there's a great big whole study on brain and language and the evolution of language, and did it evolve, or did it simply emerge? Was it an emergent process, or was it something that was designed? And there are all types of possibilities there. But language, what is it? What does it consist of? That's this whole idea with regard to the views on the nature of language. The nature of language is complex. That's one of the first things that you want to know. It's complex and it's multi-level. Complex because it deals with a variety of components, both rule-driven and audible and possibly legible, things that are sound-based or things that are written. Whole bunch of different variables that are involved, and they're also multi-level. We've got multi-level. We can just, for example, look at a sentence. I have an ice cream cone, and I can look at it from a phonological point of view, from a syntactic point of view, from a lexical point of view. And so there are a variety of levels that we can look at there, right? Even from a cultural point of view. So we've got levels and we have complexity involved in this whole concept of language. Variety of things that you can look at, as I said before. We've got phonology or sound. We've got morphology, or the endings that have meanings. We've got semantics, lexis, pragmatics. And that's the interaction of language with other people, and also how they mean in context. Okay, we also have 2 basic databases that are in the system. We have the database of vocabulary or lexis or lexicon, and we have the database of grammar or syntax. And we have these 2 databases, and some are going to say, you know what, they're 2 separate things. Others will say it may not be 2. They may kind of be connected, or they're on a continuum, right? And this particular morpheme only fits here, and so it's kind of mixing the 2 together. And where do they begin and where do they end? Or are they actually one and have different components within them? It's all issues and questions that that psychiatrists and linguists grapple with now as they talk about the nature of language. Another issue that they're going to try to grapple with is the issue of competence versus performance. Now, depending on the linguists that you're talking about, there's going to be a difference between competence and performance. Your basic explanation here is that competence are the things that you know or that your brain knows with regard to a language. You may not consciously know why certain rules are, but there's a rule in your head, for example, with regard to a negative, right? I not hit the ball instead of I did not hit the ball. Why do I need to put a did there? You may not know that rule. Your brain knows that rule, right? Or your mind knows that rule. Oh, maybe your brain knows that rule. Your unconscious knows that rule. You may not. And so that's a rule type of thing. That's a competence type of thing. That doesn't mean that you can actually produce it. It may be that you have your brain doesn't know that rule, and so you can't produce it. But it may be that your brain does know the rule, but there are other things, other factors that are inhibiting the performance. And so we've got this, again, this dichotomy. We have the understanding of it, and then we have the production of it. Anybody learning a second language also knows that they can hear and understand much more than when they can produce a language. And that's oftentimes because there are other factors that come into the communication when you're listening to something or watching something, and you can understand it. But if you're trying to produce it, you need to, quote unquote, know more. And again, so you're performing. To produce is different from understanding, from that competence. Now, some linguists are going to say, are they really separate? Are they on a continuum? Are they actually both together? Are they both accessible? Some will say, well, performance obviously is accessible because we can produce. But the rules that we have in our brain, can we actually analyze them metacognitively, metalinguistically? Some will say we can, others will say we can't. Again, that's going to be a debate on this whole idea on the view of language. We had a lot of interesting things that are going on, but recently with the with the use of computers, we also have this area of corpus linguistics. Basically what they're doing is they're taking a computer or a database of information, and they can analyze language through a computer analysis, through analyzing a database, asking a query on certain information and getting some information back, and we learn more about language. Some examples I could think of that probably came from Corpus is the use of language and gender. Who uses what words more? Or the use of a study that I actually did on Shakespeare, and you're looking at the language of Shakespeare and analyzing which words were used during emotional times and which words were used during non-emotional times. And my small analysis kind of indicated that emotional language was more traditional English, Anglo-Saxon type of language, and less French-German type of language. I could only do that by doing some form of corpus analysis. And so we have this new tool at our disposal as we view language and try to learn more about the nature of language. Okay? Now, the last point that I have here is that how does language use, how we use language in terms of reading and writing, listening and speaking, okay, the actual production. How is the fact that we're using language help us learn about the language itself, which is like the syntax and the lexicon, the grammar and the vocabulary? And so we're using language in such a way. How does that help us learn the rules or the underlying components involved? Some will say we can learn a lot based on using. Others will say we can't. But these are some of the views on the nature of language, what language is, and how current theorists, current linguists are actually viewing this whole concept of what language is, or the nature of language. Thanks to Chomsky and his followers, we also can look at something called the language acquisition device, which might be in the brain. And so we want to find out whether that device actually can work to our advantage as far as learning a second language. Other element here, nature versus nurture. There are cultures within English society, English-speaking societies, that they speak to their children, and they speak to them when they're very young. Some of them even before they're born, they're out reading a book to this kid in utero. Others read to kids when they're very young, and so they assume that a lot of this nurturing is going to help them learn language and progress faster or at a better rate. But then there's also the nature element, and actually what was actually put into the system while the child was being developed inside. Are they hardwired? Do they have stuff in here that's hardwired for them to learn language? And so there's this dichotomy. I personally see that both sides are necessary. You do have the specific software and hardware that are pre-set up, but things also need to be used in order to grow and to grow properly. So I see both pieces there. Another one is the brain, the thing that's inside here, or the mind. Is it one big unit that doesn't have any individualized or specialized sections, or is it broken down? Is it modular? A lot of the researchers today believe or have done research and say that it is modular. There are these little components. If it is an innate language module, as Chomsky would call it, there are some 4 possible outcomes. The module works for first language and works for a second language. So that language learning system that's in our head that helps us pattern match and figure out how to use a language can be used in both first language and second language. Meaning the things and tools that we have when we're little tots should be able to help us learn in the same way as when we're older. Another theory would be that it works for first language, but when you get beyond a certain age, it's not going to work for second language. And so you have to learn in a completely different way. A third option here is that this language acquisition device that's in the brain operates for first language. It doesn't operate for second language, but it serves as a template or a model for learning second language. So you consciously, or the mind subconsciously, uses that model in an attempt to develop the second language. So it's like a template for them to learn, for the brain or for you to learn that second language. And so it's a help. It's not as good as having the actual device there active and running, but it's a help. Third one is that it operates for the first language and not fully for the second language. Part of it is there, part of it you can use, part of it needs to be supplemented. And so those are some of the theories that are out there with regard to whether this innate ability is accessible, is available to second language learners. And there are guys out there doing research on this language learning process. Personally, I think it's very interesting to try to figure out what these systems are in the brain and how they can be used. If they're not active now, can they be reactivated? I find that interesting. One of the scenes I love from The Matrix is where Trinity needs to fly a helicopter, and so she gets on her little communication system and says, "I need to learn how to fly one of these helicopters." And Neo says, "You know how to fly one of these?" And she blinks her eyes a couple of times, and she says, "I do now," because they downloaded that information into her brain. I would love for her to be able to do that with language, where you can download that information somehow and have an understanding of it. Now, language is much more complex than just the technical schematics to run a computer, because you have a lot of cultural and other things involved there. I'll suffice it to say, it's interesting research to go in and see what the brain has, what it's capable of doing, and possibly if we can activate something that's been dormant. Language learning process also, as I've said before, it has some systematicity, it has some systematic processes that are involved in learning language, and it also has to deal with variety. And we'll talk more about this in later sessions, but we have these two competing ideas as we continue to study second language acquisition. We need systematic learning because of it, and we use that to learn. We have that systematic learning, but we also have to deal with variability. And the ways that people can use language creatively. So, in this language learning process, a lot of the research has discovered that there are developmental stages to second language learning, just as there are in first language learning. And through these developmental stages, people begin to learn a language. They begin to acquire control over particular morphemes, and they develop a temporary or a test language, which they would call an interlanguage, a language that's in your head that's kind of dynamic. Things are still going on, and there's some testing going on to see if this rule is right, and if it's not right, well, then it tries to change that rule. And so there are things that are going on during this process. There again, you see that it's a systematic development here. There are going to be errors that are involved. There's going to be incomplete success, possibly. Because you've tried something and it didn't work. You've tried some things and they did work. And so you're going to have this as you go along. You may run into something called fossilization, where someone, as they're trying to learn new language, they eventually stop learning. Normally you have this, up-down type of plateau as they're growing and more advanced, but they may just flatline. They may hit a plateau and then they're not going to learn anymore, and they've become fossilized. They've stopped learning at a particular level, and they may have fossilized with mistakes and errors. That's just the way language works. That's part of that process. It may not come to the end. It may not come to fruition. Another way of looking at the language learning process is the concept of creativity and routine. In order to create language, we need to have a set of rules in place in our head. So says Chomsky and the like. And with those rules, we can create unique languages. We can create unique phrases and ideas and thoughts that have never been thought of before. We can articulate them in words, okay? But we need to know the rules in order to do that. Now, there are other things that we use with language that we don't even think about. You walk into the office and, you don't need to think about a creative way to say good morning. You say, good morning, how are you? Right? You don't need to think of a creative way when you pull up to the drive-thru to ask for a meal, or go to the post office and ask for a stamp. That's just chunks of information that you use over and over again all the time. It's standard types of information that you use. So we've got routine events and we've got creative events. And in the language learning process, there's information that we just put into a routine event. We don't even think about them. There are other times where we have to be creative, find creative ways to use language. And in the language learning process, we can use both. We can learn routines, and that way we don't have to think about them anymore. We can also learn to be creative. I remember a story of a gentleman telling me about the years that he studied German, and he remembered 2 sentences. And the sentences were, do you know where the train station is? And the answer that he had learned was, yes, it's down the road, turn left at the second road. That's what he learned. And he didn't remember anything else. However, one day he was a businessman and he traveled to Germany, and he's walking down the street and someone taps him on his shoulder and asks him, excuse me, do you know where the train station is? In perfect German. Without thinking, it became routine to him. Without thinking, he said, yes, go down. It's down this road. At the second road, turn left. And the poor gentleman sent him off to some wrong location, but it was routine. He learned that routine. So we can learn routines in order to learn language. We can also be creative. Again, the theory that we have needs to be able to account for both. So we have creativity for new things. We have creativity because of the rules generation, and we have routines with these prefabricated chunks. We also have some cross-linguistic influence. Influence from a first language, okay? Sometimes I may not know a word, or I can see that this word is similar in both languages, and I can pull that information over. Or I can see that the grammar of this particular structure is very similar or the same in my language, in my first language, so I can pull that over and try to use that. It could be right, it could be wrong. That influence can be positive or negative. So that's part of the language learning process. When the person who's learning language doesn't know what the proper answer is, they may try to steal from their first language. Could be successful, could not be successful. Depends. Other things related to the language learning process. This is trying to push all this together with regard to teaching. Okay, how does the second language use impact second language learning in the classroom? We have all these theories. How's this going to help you as a teacher? if you're going to be teaching a language, or you as a learner if you're going to be learning a second language. For example, this whole idea of competence versus performance. There are going to be some researchers out there who say competence is really nothing that we need to discuss as a language teacher because we don't have access to them. Remember, I talked about this before. Now, others are going to say, no, we do have access to them, therefore we should want to learn them and help us get greater confidence so that we can improve our performance. It's going to depend on what you believe, right? Also have people who've brought in theories like Krashen and Terrell. And we'll talk about his theories later on, but he's got issues regarding getting input. I need a lot of input so that students can learn. Based on all of this input, they can learn language. I can also learn because I'm negotiating meaning. And what I mean by that is, you and I are both second language learners. We're both learning French, and we're both trying to speak to each other. We're both trying to understand each other, and we negotiate with each other what particular words, concepts, and ideas mean so that we can communicate. And through this negotiation of meaning, we continue to learn language. Okay? So, do we need to teach the formal structures of language? Do we need to teach the grammar and the vocabulary? Or do we just give input? Get lots of input that's going on. Another type of a process that some people are using is saying, don't think about the syntax, don't think about the lexicon. Just get involved in lots of input, and your mind will start making these connections, just like connectionism or neural networks that are being automatically developed in kind of a computer world. Where they have this connectionism, where nodes are simply being connected because of the slight differences that allow the network to grow and expand. Another issue that's involved in the language learning process is this whole issue of fluency versus control. Fluency, how fluid language is when you use it. I don't know if you've ever met anybody, and they're very correct in how they create language. They use proper vocabulary, proper grammar when they create something, but it takes them 5 minutes to finish a sentence because they don't flow well. Then you have other people who flow very well, and they can keep the conversation going and keep the communication going, but they make errors in the construction of language. They don't have control, but they have fluency. And within this language learning process, there's this debate. Where do you put your emphasis? One, the other, both? Do you put more emphasis on one at the beginning, more emphasis on one at the end? How does that work out? We also have some relation with the language competence. Some people would like to separate knowledge as a skill. Language competence as a skill. All right? Understanding how to do this is a skill. I need to learn these skills. Others look at it as knowledge, as information. Okay? Again, the more the theoretical. Are they the same or are they different? Are they separate entities? Is the language competence knowledge, or is it a skill, or are they both? Okay? Again, issues that they're going to be dealing with regard to language use. Other researchers have suggested that in addition to input, because there's a problem with only having input, and that's that there's not enough input to help someone learn all that they need to learn to understand the language. And so because of the poverty of input, that they need to also do output. And they need to produce. So little kids, they start producing, they start repeating what you're saying, or they start trying to talk, and that's output also goes back and becomes input. And the output they give allows for communication with other people, and they can learn what they know, what they don't know, so that they can learn more. Okay? That's this whole idea of comprehensible output. I need to have output. Input is good, it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So this idea, for example, with Swain and others, with this idea of comprehensible output and interaction hypothesis has emerged. Some questions regarding negative evidence, or negative feedback, I guess I should say. There are times where someone makes a mistake and you try to correct them. This is especially good with kids, where kids make a mistake and you try to correct them, and as you correct them, you're hoping they'll change, but it appears to be rather ineffectual. You giving advice, information to someone, no matter how often or hard you try, many times it falls on on not deaf ears, but it falls short of what you want to do because people don't change. Possibly because their inner language isn't ready for that change, right? The rules that they're trying to develop have either been fossilized or they're not ready to acquire this new rule, and so they're not going to change. Talk to a little kid and they say paschetti instead of spaghetti. No matter how many times you try to correct them, oftentimes they're not going to remember, and they're trying to communicate, and so they're not going to be able to fix that problem. Okay. So positive evidence may be the only thing that is necessary. And by positive evidence, we're talking about positive input and positive output, right? Additionally, interaction aids in autonomous second language learning systems. So the more interaction that you have, the more that these things become autonomous. The more that the rules and the prefabricated chunks that people are beginning to use become automated, autonomous. You don't think about it anymore. It just becomes part of the system, and your fluency increases using those systems. Lastly, there are sociolinguistic issues that are there. In sociolinguistics, some of the issues are go back to the issue of interaction, needing to interact with others so that we can learn. So we have this constructed or this negotiated meeting that's going on. We also have scaffolding. And by scaffolding, when you have a building and they put those little things next to the building to help shore things up so that they can reinforce or build whatever it is. That scaffolding can be used in language as well, where you provide support for someone who's learning language. And that only works within a societal type of, within a group. You're only going to be able to get that. So there are a variety of issues and theories that are impacting how second language learning is going on, and how some of those things you can use and or not use in the classroom. Let's take a quick look here at some of the views of a language learner. It's broad. Okay, we've got kids who are learning language, we have adults who are learning language, and we've got teenagers, so we've got a variety of age levels, and that's going to impact how language is learned as well. We also have the style of learning, whether it's formal or whether it's informal. And that's going to impact how language is learned. It's the intensity of the language learning, the duration of each language learning session. How long can it be before it becomes ineffectual? It's going to be different on different ages. Now, researchers who are looking into language learning and doing research in those areas, they basically do research in 3 areas. They do research in the linguistic area. They do research in the socio-psychological area, where they're doing research on how many of these affective areas or many of the things that are going on in the brain, in the mind, impact language learning. And then sociocultural. How the cultural impact, first culture, second culture, the interaction between those cultures, how that impacts language learning. There are a number of ways, a number of factors. No, there are a number of views or perspectives that researchers take when they're doing research on second language learning. Another thing that they're going to look at is the learner is a language processor. The mind is a pattern matching machine, and it's out there trying to match up, trying to learn language as it goes along, and it's just doing that. And of course, the real question is how much ability does that mind have to process language? Okay, if they can do it more quickly, if they're at a particular age, or they have, the certain amount of proteins, they may learn at a different rate. They may learn faster. They may understand more. They may be at an age where they don't have those anymore, and it's going to take longer to get that done. There are cognitive factors that are involved. Cognitive factors, things like being intelligence. And you may have an intelligence that lends support to learning language. You may have one that doesn't. And just from what I have seen, intelligence is not an indicator of how well you learn language. There are very intelligent, quote-unquote intelligent people who have difficulty learning language, and there are people who are very unintelligent who have difficulty learning language. So it is a factor, but it's certainly not the primary factor. Language aptitude, right? The knack for learning language that some people have, and they're very good at it. and others who don't have that, right? People who use language learning strategies, they know the strategies and they can use them. So those are some of the cognitive factors. There are affective factors. I may have that intelligence, I may have that aptitude, I may know the strategies, but I'm not motivated. I am not going to learn. That's a factor. Anxiety, worried that I don't produce language properly, or angry, that's the next one, social factors. Angry because the culture that I'm in, this new culture, this second language that I'm learning, they don't like my culture. And because they don't like my culture, well, I'm not going to like I'm not going to try to enter their culture. My ability to learn language is going to go down because I'm not motivated, because I'm angry, right? So willingness to learn would be another. How willing am I to join this new culture? How willing am I to learn this new language so that I can enter in? Some of the social factors. It might be that you're in a class that inhibits you from wanting to learn. Maybe there's a power issue. And you don't want to learn this language because it's being forced on you. Okay? It could be that. It could be a gender issue. And learning language could be impeded or helped because of gender. Could be an ethnic issue that can hurt or help in language learning. So there are a number of factors that are involved in this process. This is just a brief overview of all the things that we hope to jump into as we look at second language acquisition. We're going to be jumping into these in a little more detail as we go through this process. I do hope this was helpful for you. If you do have any questions, kindly let me know. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.